in the ATL. That's my homeboy. Watch your back if you're gonna walk alone, boy. Cause everybody in the homeboys trying to get rich. You can get hit even if you're known, boy. We the kings of the South. Pies in the oven, grills in the mouths. Count stacks.
What's up, everybody? So today we're gonna work on the S15 on Terry's truck, and he needs the top end of the motor pulled off. We think that the intake gaskets are blown, so I'm gonna go ahead and pull his intake, his distributor off, pull the plugs in it, set it on top dead center of cylinder number 1. And I'm gonna see if I can't figure out if the intake gaskets are blown. If not, I'm just gonna throw a new set on anyways. And he's got a really cheap intake manifold on this thing, and the oil fitting gauge for the oil pressure gauge, it actually touches almost the back of the intake manifold. So when I pull the intake off, I'm gonna shave a little bit of the aluminum down back there so that way you can actually get the fitting in and out. So I'm just gonna start pulling the intake manifold off. All right, so the first step is gonna be getting all the spark plugs out. So that's what I'm about to go ahead and do now, get all the plugs out. Stuff like this, it's really good to use a spark plug socket, because where you can't get a regular socket and a regular ratchet on, if you use a spark plug socket, it's got a hex head built into the top of it, so you can go ahead and put a wrench on that. Now time to go to the passenger side. Sometimes when a spark plug socket won't work, a regular socket won't work, you have to get creative, and that's where these wrenches right here come in pretty handy. Alrighty, so I got all the plugs out. Now the next step is seeing anything else that's in the way of getting the intake off. You know for a fact the distributor is going to have to come out, so that's why the plugs need to come out. You need to bump it over on top dead center of number 1 cylinder. You can't do that now. You can find it later, yes, but it's just a little bit easier right now. And just check out where the rotor button comes out. It should be on the number 1 cylinder on the cap. Then just check out for anything else. We know you got to take the water neck off. You got to take the alternator bracket off. And anything else like that. So just take a look, see what else got to come off. All right, next step is to get the motor on top dead center and cylinder number 1 be on the compressor stroke. So to do that, you're going to go ahead and get a breaker bar or a breaker bar ratchet or anything like that and get a 5/8 socket on it. And you're going to go ahead and put it down here on the balancer bolt and turn the motor over. At the same time, I'm going to put my finger in the spark plug hole for the number 1 cylinder, and you will feel a bunch of air, almost like your fingers trying to get pressed out of the hole, and that's when you're going to know that you're on the compression stroke. Now to do the same thing, as soon as I feel like I've got all the way to the top of that stroke, I will stop and I use a little feeler or a screwdriver or anything like that, stick into the spark plug hole, and you can actually feel if the piston is all the way at the top of that cylinder. Alrighty, we're at top dead center, and the number 1 cylinder is on the compression stroke, so now we're good to go. Alright, next step I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and remove the alternator bracket, because that has to come off to clear for the intake to lift off. One thing I like doing is whenever I take hardware off of something, I always like putting the hardware back into where it went, as long as it's not going to get in my way. It takes up less space in your little magnetic trays, and it makes just for a better chance that you're not going to lose any of the hardware when you go to put everything back together. So the alternator bracket I just took off, I'm going to go ahead and put the bolts back in where they went to hold the bracket in place, but leave the bracket off. Alright, next thing I'm going to take off is the throttle bracket, because it's in the way. It's got to come off with the intake come off, and it's just in the way, and it'll be easier to take the distributor out if that's out of the way. So let's take that off now. All right, next step is to go ahead and get the distributor out. You're going to need a distributor wrench to take the bottom bolt out. Sometimes you can get lucky enough and use a regular wrench. In this case, it's open enough where you can. So we're going to go ahead and pull the distributor. All right, next step is getting the water neck off and the thermostat out. I usually save this for last because this is usually the most messiest part of the job right here. All right, not too bad. And one more thing I want to notice too is that I went ahead and put a pair of needle nose vice grips down here on the hose, just real loosely, so I wouldn't puncture the hose or anything like that. But that help keeps a lot of the antifreeze flow from coming down on top of the thermostat and making a mess all over your entire manifold and just making a bigger mess for you in the end. And having to work in it, and sticky antifreeze does not go good with hands trying to take sockets on and off ratchets. So quick little tip. All right, now we're ready to take the intake manifold off. It's 12 bolts total. This one looks like they seem to be all 9/16. So I'm going to go ahead and pull all those bolts, and then I'll show you how to get the manifold off, because you have to be very careful if you start prying up here on the china rail or on the intake and the gasket seating surface. So I'll show you how to go ahead and do that next. All right, so now you got all the bolts out and you're ready to pull the intake manifold, but not so fast. Double check anything that's sitting on the manifold, anything that as soon as you get it off, they could fall down into the engine that you wouldn't be able to get out. Because underneath here, there's a lot, in the lifter valley, there's a lot of little small openings that go down into where the cam is, down into the rotating assembly and stuff like that. And you might need to just double check yourself real fast, for you cause a lot of work and a lot of money for yourself in the long run. So I'll just double check real fast before you just start prying the intake off. All right, to pry the intake off, I've got just a small pry bar, and I usually like to use just a dead blow hammer, something that's not causing a whole lot of force to go down on here, and hopefully it'll end up cracking the RTV off and get the intake manifold loose. You can hear by that sound right there that I just opened the intake a little bit. You can hear the hollow kind of sound. That means that you've started to break it loose a little bit. And just pry a little bit. You don't want to pry too hard. You want to try to work your way around it evenly, so that way you don't end up cracking anything. All right, so I got the intake manifold off. The next step is to clean up any kind of antifreeze or anything that did fall down into the lifter valley underneath where the intake manifold sits. So I went ahead and did that, and I checked out the bottom of the intake manifold, and my assumption was right. He did not, the guy that Terry took this to before me, he did some very questionable work, and he did not put any type of sealer around the water jackets on the intake manifold gaskets at all. You don't have to put sealer or RTV or any kind of like gasket maker on the whole entire intake gaskets, but it is always good to put just a little bit around the water jackets, because they tend to still leak, even though it says sometimes you don't have to. But I always end up putting a little bit of RTV or silicone or something around the water jackets, and I found out that half of the intake manifold bolts were loose anyways. So I went ahead and got the gaskets off of the intake manifold. I still got to clean the bottom of that up, but the next step is to go ahead and put a towel or something to catch any kind of the old silicone or anything of the old sealant to clean the heads up inside of the lifter valley. And then you're going to take a razor blade scraper and scrape the seating surface of the heads where the intake manifold sits up to the heads. So that's what I'm going to go ahead and do now. Alrighty, I went ahead and pulled the valve covers too, because these valve covers, depending on what kind of valve covers you're running, They do have a little lip on them, and sometimes the intake manifold's not going to want to sit back down flush all the way. So I just went ahead and pulled them anyways. But the next step is to go ahead and scrape off any of the seating surface where the intake manifold gaskets or the intake manifold is going to sit. So that means right here on the heads, and right here on the front china rail, and on the back china rail. So that's what I'm going to go ahead and do now. Now, on these, it's not too bad because the paper towel will catch most of it, but as you can see, there is a gap. So whenever you do the china rails, you want to try to scrape this way towards the outside of the motor the whole entire time. One thing I forgot to mention is that for the intake ports, it would be better to put like a little paper towel or a little rag or something inside of those ports so any kind of debris doesn't fall into those. Now the water jacket ports and the old EGR valve ports doesn't matter as bad, but I mean you can if you want to, but seeing as how this motor is getting ready to get pulled anyways, and this is just pretty much getting put back together good enough to drive it from here back over to Terry's house, I'm not too worried about it because I think we got some other problems with some ring seal and the valve seals and stuff like that in this motor anyways. But if it was a brand new motor, or if it doesn't got that many miles on it, or the motor is actually really good, I would go ahead and put towels in every port and every jacket up here in the heads just to be safe. All right, so now that you got the block cleaned up and ready, and all the old RTV is silicone prepped and off of that, now you got to go ahead and do the intake manifold, because as you can see, you got to get all of any of this stuff off. It has to be pretty much like a machine surface, so that way all the new gaskets and the new RTV and the silicone can all seal up really, really good. All right, now you got the bottom surface cleaned up. I like to go ahead and while it's off and it's easier to get to, clean where the distributor gasket goes and take the thermostat out and clean that right now. It's just easier while you got it off, and you're not laying over an engine bay trying to get it, so I'll just go ahead and do it now. All right, one thing I like doing after you got all the gasket material taken off and cleaned off the heads and the mating surface, and you got the rags out of the lifter valley and out of the intake ports, I like to take some acetone or some paint thinner and just put it on a rag and wipe down all of the mating surfaces on both this and on the intake manifold itself. Alrighty, so now you're ready to put the intake gaskets on. But first, when you get them, take a look at them, because they are directional. That's why if you take a look at this one right here, it says this side up. So that means this side would be facing towards the intake manifold, and this side would be going down towards the heads. So pay attention to that. And then I'm gonna go ahead and show you how to put some RTV or some silicone around the water jacket ports down here on the end, just a little bit, just enough to help seal them, besides more than what the gasket can do. So that's the next step. Alrighty, after you've cleaned the mating surface off, the next thing you're going to do is just take a little bit of silicone and just take it and rub it around the water jackets. Not a whole lot, because you're going to do this to the bottom side of the intake manifold too, but just put a little bit down here so that way it helps seals up. Alright, I'm going to go ahead and sit the gaskets on here and let them just get a little bit tacky so they don't move around too bad. Now pay attention to what side this is, because this says this side up. So that means this is going to be facing towards the intake manifold and this side's going to go down towards the heads. This side up. All right, now you got the intake gasket sitting on there and you got the water jacket sealed up. Now the next thing is you got to seal up both China rails. That's the front and the back half of the intake manifold where it meets the block. There's going to be a gap there. Now a lot of people like to use gaskets in between there with a little bit of RTV on both. But I heard something a long time ago that says it'd be a lot more likely for that gasket to blow out, seeing how just sandwiched in between two layers of silicone. So what I like to do is I just like to go get a whole entire caulk gun pretty much of RTV, and then I just make a nice little, like almost like a weld bead across the whole entire China rail. And I'll show you, because right where the heads meet the block, right there in the corner, you want to make sure you get a really good amount right there. And that just helps seal up any oil from leaking out, or any oil getting into the intake manifold, or into the intake ports, I mean, and into the water jackets if you didn't seal anything up. So it's very important to seal this stuff up really, 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 really good. So I'll go ahead and get showing you that right now. Alrighty, now it's time to set the intake manifold onto the motor. And as you can see, the beads are really fat, but there is going to be access to squeeze out the front. And I like to go ahead and wait till that hardens up, and then you can just come through with a knife in the front and clean cut it. And it looks really nice, it looks really clean, instead of trying to wipe it off while it's still wet and make a big old mess. So I prefer just go ahead, let it harden up, and then you can cut it off with a knife, and it looks a lot better, and it looks like a better product in the end. Alrighty, one thing I like doing on the center bolt holes, they are not a blind hole, which means that they are a hole that continuously goes down until it opens up at the bottom and the lifter valley is right underneath it there. So you want to put some kind of sealant on these two center holes on both sides. Now all the holes around the water jackets, those are all blind holes, so you don't have to worry about putting any type of sealant on those. But for the center holes, I always like to put some kind of seal on there. And for that, I like to use just this stuff right here. It's just Teflon based, it doesn't harden up. And it's done good for me. It's what I used to use to seal head bolts and all kinds of other stuff. All right, I'm just gonna go ahead and get these snug with the intake for right now, and then I'll go back down and kind of go in kind of a torque sequence, just pretty much working from my inside out to both ends. Alrighty, and there you go. Intake is bolted down, gaskets are sealed up, good to go. China rails are sealed up, good to go. Now on to the next step. Alright, the next step is going to be putting the distributor back in. Now there's a little trick to this, because there is these teeth right here at the bottom of the distributor shaft that has to mesh up with the teeth that are cut in the camshaft. And you have to make sure that you get the rotor button pointed to the number 1 on the cylinder cap, where the number 1 spark plug wire would be. But on top of all of that, there is a little fork almost cut like a flathead screwdriver cut into the bottom of this distributor gear. Now, it corresponds with the gear, or I guess with the slot that is in the oil pump drive shaft. So your cam turns the distributor, and it also turns the oil pump by the oil pump drive shaft. Now, what I like to do is get a long screwdriver and get down in here where the distributor sits down and almost clock that to where it would line up perfectly with the number one spark plug, where the number one spark plug wire goes on the cap. So that's what I'm gonna do next. I don't know how good you can see it, but you can almost see kind of a little slot down there in the oil pump drive shaft. That is what you're trying to clock to get it to line up to where the rotor button is going to be facing. That should be about perfect right there. The screwdriver came up just like this. If I turn it just a little bit, you'll see that the screwdriver is going to be pointing right towards the number one cylinder. All right, let's go ahead and try to drop the distributor in. Let's see, we got that right there. Let's go ahead and see if we can get it set in. Sometimes it takes a couple tries, but let's see how we can do. Perfect right there, first try. Sometimes if there's a little bit of a gap right here in between the distributor and the intake manifold, but you've got the rotor button, you've got the rotor pointing face right where you want it, sometimes you can take a 5/8 socket and put it down here on the crank bolt in the front, like how you bump the motor over to get it on top of the center. Sometimes if you just turn it ever so slightly, it'll turn, and because the teeth are already lined up with the camshaft, sometimes it helps just turn a little bit to get it right down onto that oil pump drive shaft, and the distributor will slap right down in. But this time we're good to go. So now we're going to go ahead and put the clamp in to hold the distributor down loosely. You want to leave it loose a little bit so that way when we go back to retime and check the timing of the motor, that we don't got it locked all the way down. Alright, so we're ready to throw the valve covers back on the Terrier's motor. But the valve covers that were on here, he had quart gaskets on here, and the guy that he had put them on here RTV'd them both to the valve cover and to the head, so he put RTV on both sides of the gasket. I hate doing that because that's what, if you ever had to check anything, if you ever had to redo your valves, do anything like that, when you go to pull the valve covers off, you wreck the gaskets, and it just makes for a pain in the butt to get them off. So I went ahead and got all the old gasket material off of here. I just scraped it off. Then I just chucked a wire wheel and a drill and cleaned it off pretty good. Blow dried it off and put some lacquer thinner back on here, wiped it all off. Got any of the oil residue off of here. So I'm gonna show you a tip. I like to put RTV on the valve cover, then put the gasket onto the valve cover, flip them over, let them sit for a while, let the RTV get stiffened, and then that's all that you do. You do not put no RTV or any kind of sealer on the other side of the gasket. That way it would be gluing to the head. This way the valve cover gasket stays stuck to the valve cover. You can pull them all off as one assembly, put them all back on as one assembly. Makes for a lot nicer installation, and if you ever got to take them off, makes it a lot easier. So now I'm going to go ahead and lay some silicone, just a little bit, just enough to keep the gasket onto the valve cover. I'm going to go ahead and run around and put some silicone onto the valve covers. All right, now you're ready to put the valve cover gaskets onto the valve covers. Now we're going to go ahead and let those sit up for a little bit, and then we'll be good to go. We'll be good to throw them on. All right, so while the valve covers are starting to set up, the valve cover gaskets on those, I'm going to go ahead and put the thermostat in, and thermostat gasket on. Let that tack up for a minute before I put the thermostat housing on, and then we'll go ahead and try to see if the valve covers are set up enough to go ahead and throw them on. All right, now we're going to go ahead and put the thermostat housing back onto the motor. I always like to start one of the longer bolts or the smaller bolt first, so that way you know where it's at in relation, just before you go ahead and press it all down and get it all sealed up. All right, so now both the bolts are started. So now you can go ahead and push her down. you go. Thermostat is back in. Thermostat housing's on. All sealed up. All right, now we're ready to put the valve covers back onto the motor. All right, now one tip on this. When you're tightening the valve cover gaskets down, or the valve covers, especially seeing as how this is cork gaskets, you cannot put that much, you can't tighten the bolts that hard. Especially with the cork gaskets, you'll crack them and then it won't seal, especially how these are not glued to both sides. It's just glued to the valve cover. So you just want to go in a cross pattern. So you start here, there, here, and there. Or vice versa, and work your way around. Just get it kind of snug, just good enough to where they won't back out, good enough to where the valve cover gasket is going to be hold up tight against the head and it's going to seal and won't leak. Good to go. Now we're going to move on to the other side. All right, good to go. Now it's time to put the alternator bracket back on. I know this isn't that good an alternator bracket. Somebody's cut this last ear up here. That would essentially go to this bolt right here, but it's good enough right now, and this motor's getting pulled anyway, so it keeps the belt on, so it's good enough. And it doesn't, like, it's not like this truck's a daily driver. It only gets run every now and then. All right, guys, that's pretty much it. It's pretty much where we found it when we started this video, and I think this is where I'm going to go ahead and call it, because we can't complete everything. I'm not putting the cap and these wires back on that came off of this truck, so pretty much I'm just waiting on parts for Terry to go ahead and get the next paycheck, bring the parts over, and then we slap them on. And I will show the videos on that, so that way you guys can go ahead and see this thing running. I'm still waiting on an electric fuel pump, those caps and those wires. I'm not putting that throttle bracket back on because that throttle bracket sucks. Going to see if I can't get him a better one. Maybe ruffle around here in the garage, see if I can come up with something a little bit better than that. Let's see what else we got. Oh yeah, the carburetor. You guys didn't see me pull the carburetor off. Terry actually came here a few nights ago and pulled the carburetor off. We're gonna see if we can't borrow our buddy Brian's off of his Monte Carlo, throw it on here just to start it up, because I know it's a really good running carburetor. He bought a brand new out the box not too long ago, last year. Hasn't put hardly any runtime on it at all, so I know it works really good. I ran it on the 71 C10 I got for a little bit till I rebuilt my other carburetor. So it's a good running carburetor. So, and actually the plugs, I'm gonna see if I can get some new plugs too. But just stay tuned. That was pretty much the how-to Gen 1 small block Chevy intake manifold swap or repair intake gaskets. So just follow that step by step and you'll be good to go. Out.